Since our special subject this evening is Iraq, I hope I've put it in some context to you. I must explain as honestly as I can why it is that I came to the conclusion that a settlement of accounts with Saddam Hussein must be made and that the Iraqi people must be helped to move into the post-Saddam Hussein era. As I've just said, I'm not a fetishist of the rules of the United Nations or of its procedures, the ones that abandoned Rwanda and Bosnia, for example, and that allowed a Russian veto or a Chinese veto on any attempt to do anything about these things as well. I remind you that in May of the year 2003, Iraq was going to become the chairman of the United Nations Special Committee on Disarmament. In other words, the Committee on Disarmament would have been headed by someone appointed by Saddam Hussein. At the same period, the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations, I think, had the chairmanship of Colonel Gaddafi. The United Nations had failed us very badly in all these crises, and I want you to keep that in mind as we go along. But let us apply the criteria that the United Nations itself applies for discovering when a state has put itself outside the pale, when it has lost its sovereignty, when the international community may be called upon to intervene. There are 4 conditions under which it may be said that a state has lost its sovereignty, sacrificed it. 1, repeated aggressions against neighboring states, or occupations of or annexations of same. 2nd, violations of the Genocide Convention. The Genocide Convention, for those who sign it, we are among the signatories, mandates action without further recourse to any further resolution in the case of genocide, either to prevent or to punish it. That's mandatory. 3rd, collusion by the relevant state with international gangsterism, harboring, in other words, of terrorism. 9th. And 4th, violations of the Non-Proliferation Treaty or other, shall we say, promiscuous behavior in respect of weapons of mass destruction. Iraq meets all 4 of those conditions in a serial manner. It had invaded Iran, it had tried to destroy and abolish, obliterate the state of Kuwait. It still retained the ambition to repeat both aggressions. It had violated the Genocide Convention by very well and exhaustively documented state campaign of murder known as the Anfal campaign, of which we have now all the incriminating documents in our possession, to try and not just disperse but to destroy the Kurdish population of northern Iraq, using for the purpose, as it had with the intervention in Iran, weapons of mass destruction, principally of chemical description and type. It had sheltered Mr. Yassin, the man most wanted for the blowing up of the World Trade Center in New York in 1993. It had sheltered Mr. Abu Nidal, who, before the advent of Mr. Osama bin Laden, was the most wanted international gangster in the world, specializing in the assassination of democratic members of the Palestine Liberation Organization. It had, in the name of its own president, Saddam Hussein, openly paid a bounty for every suicide bomber operating in the Israeli-Palestine dispute, and its agents and envoys had been repeatedly meeting with agents and envoys of Al-Qaeda in various locations in what I would describe as a kind of Hitler-Stalin pact between 2 discrepant forms of jihadist regime. It had adopted itself the ideology of jihad, dropping its old Ba'athist fascism, and finally, it refused stubbornly and repeatedly to come into compliance with any United Nations resolution governing weapons of mass destruction. It never came into compliance until the last day of its existence. It created a special Department of State for the concealment of weapons of mass destruction, and had never given an account of the weapons that it had declared to the UN inspectors some years before. The option of further coexistence with such a regime simply did not exist. And all of this would have been the case long before we became aware, in the abrupt way in which we became made aware of it, of the really genuine threat of an Islamic fascism that, among other things, the beggaring and destruction of Afghanistan, the reduction of Afghanistan to a serf state with women as chattel and Shia Muslims as targets in a free fire zone, bankruptcy, misery, starvation, slavery, not only had such achievements as that to its credit, but had managed in a small way to build a secret army within the borders of the United States. I mention that crux point because I can't not mention it, but I want to draw your attention to two things. Before the year 2001, it had been decided by a vote in the Senate, the Iraq Liberation Act in the year 1998, on the initiative of the Clinton-Gore administration, that the policy of the United States government should be the removal of the government of Saddam Hussein. That was a vote in which there was no contrary vote in the Senate, a unanimous vote to adopt the Iraq Liberation Act as American policy. The two best speeches given, in fact, about the certainty of an ultimate confrontation with Saddam Hussein on the matter of weapons and terrorism, if nothing else, were both made by President Clinton at that period. And a very significant speech made by Prime Minister Tony Blair in Chicago in 1999, after the departure of Slobodan Milosevic to The Hague, where he quite properly stands trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity, saying that this did not mean the struggle was over, because down the road there was undoubtedly going to be a meeting with Saddam Hussein and his party and the crime family with which he ran Iraq as the psychopathic state that it was, the private property of a sadistic minority.
You have 2 minutes.
Very well. I don't think I'm going to need two. If I haven't persuaded you by now that this was something that had to happen, was going to happen, probably ought to have happened in 1991 when the opportunity presented itself after the Kuwait War. I may not be able to do so in the remaining 90 seconds. What I want to dispel, though, is what I believe to be a very widespread impression that there was something improvised or faked or contrived or confected about this confrontation. I hope I've said enough to persuade you, or at least to invite you to consider persuading yourselves that what you're so glibly told about Iraq becoming a sudden target of opportunity for the Halliburton Company, or something to enhance the Bush administration's credibility after the reverses in 2001, is not really true. And that those, or in fact, isn't true at all. And that those of us who some years ago decided to range ourselves on the side of the heroic forces of opposition among Iraqi Arabs and Kurds, those who dared to think that it would be possible to take down and remove the disgusting, unlawful regime of Saddam Hussein, can be proud of what we've done, as I am. Because not only can Iraq now be certified as disarmed, which it now at last can. If you wanted to certify it as disarmed before, you'd have had to take Saddam Hussein's word for it, which I would strongly recommend you don't do. Not only are those who perpetrated the genocide at long last being ranged in the dock and brought to justice and made to face their victims, not only are the neighboring countries to Iraq able to breathe more freely because they know that a sleepless aggressor and conspirer across their borders is no longer there, but better than all that, and better than all the conformity with international resolutions that I mentioned before, I've had the opportunity to see something that I hope you one day get the chance to see too, which is what a people looks like when it's been liberated. There is no experience like that, no experience like the look on the face of people who suddenly find themselves free, who had up till then been the property of the state and the victims of torture and tyranny. And to be able to do this and all those other things too,
thank you,
is something that I envy those who didn't do it.
Thank you, Mr. Hitchens. Thank you.